One of the largest and deadliest conflicts in history, World War I left behind a trail of destruction and ruin in its wake that had rippling effects for decades to come. In the old Ottoman Empire, these effects catalyzed the formation of two distinct ideologies: Zionism, the movement for the creation of a Jewish homeland, and Arab nationalism, the push for the creation of a unified Arab state. Both movements experienced major triumphs and tragedies in the first half of the 20th century. Beginning in 1915, a series of incompatible agreements pitted Zionist aspirations against an emerging Palestinian Arab nationalist movement. Ultimately, the promise of coexistence in post-World War I Palestine was tragically altered, setting the two sides on a course for continual conflict.
One of the greatest spoils to the victors of World War I came from the fall of the Ottoman Empire in the beginning of the 20th century, which left much of their former territory in the Middle East in the hands of the French and British. This success would not have been possible without the help of the Arab population in the Middle East, who were integral in instrumenting the defeat of the Ottoman Empire. Through a series of letters known as the McMahon-Hussein Correspondence from 1915 to 16, the British had secured the assistance of the Arabs in overthrowing the Ottoman Empire in exchange for British support of an independent Arab state. Unbeknownst to the Arabs, however, the British and the French had been secretly drafting a document at the same time, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. This agreement would divide up territory of the former Ottoman Empire in the Middle East under British and French control. Directly contradictory to the McMahon-Hussein correspondences, the Sykes-Picot Agreement came as a major blow to the aspirations of Arab nationalists, and marked the beginning of a long-standing power struggle exacerbated by subsequent British foreign policy. The encroachment of colonial ambitions onto the Arab consciousness only served to drive the rise of Arab nationalism in response to the humiliation of Sykes-Picot that arbitrarily carved up historical, tribal, and ethnic regions.
More issues developed in 1917 when the British formalized their goal for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people through the Balfour Declaration. Balfour marked the first instance in history of genuine legitimization of the Zionist movement by a foreign power and prompted a new wave of nearly 40,000 Jewish people into Palestine.
It was just, a big injection of excitement amongst Zionists worldwide that the Balfour Declaration was released.
On the other hand, Palestinian Arab nationalists viewed the Balfour Declaration as a denial of their right to self-determination and feared it would lead to their economic and political subjection to the Jews.
It put a lot of fear into those Arabs in Palestine that the British were not going to be looking towards their interests and were indeed going to favor those Zionists who were settling in Palestine.
The Jewish leadership in Palestine noted these rising fears and made active attempts at incorporating the Arab population into their economic sphere. Accordingly, in the first few years of the Jewish presence in Palestine, a tenuous balance was achieved in Arab-Jewish relations as unions like the Union of Railway, Postal and Telegraph Workers became the most powerful tool in the integration of the two populations. Both sides were hopeful for peaceful coexistence even in the face of divisive British interference.
One Arab railway representative put his opinion forward in his address to the Union. I am striving to establish ties between the Jewish and Arab workers because I am certain that if we are connected, we will help one another without regard to religion or nationality. Unfortunately, this fragile balance was quickly shattered as the Jewish sought to solidify their presence, which was met with violent opposition from the Arabs. The Histadrut, the dominant Jewish labor organization in Palestine, was the first to pose a major threat to the stability of the relationship by actively breaking up integrated unions, excluding Arab labor, and initiating campaigns to boycott Arab products.
And they were very much focused on creating a Jewish economy within Palestine. They felt like their goal, or the goal of Zionism, should be to help build up a Jewish economy.
The influence of the Histadrut, combined with an influx of Jewish people into Palestine and the Balfour Declaration, pushed tensions over the edge. In 1920, a surge of violence broke out during the Nabi Musa riots, a series of Arab-led assaults on Jewish communities. Hundreds were arrested, among them a young schoolteacher by the name of Amin al-Husseini, who was charged with inciting Arab crowds through an inflammatory speech. He would later go on to be appointed the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem in the following year, a position he would take advantage of to fan the flames of the growing Arab nationalist movement, particularly against Zionism. International support for the Zionists with no mention of Palestinian Arabs only made the possibility of compromise between the two far more difficult. The official League of Nations mandate for Palestine in 1922 established British control of the region, thus laying the groundwork for the modern Jewish state. This was another major triumph for the Zionist movement, official recognition and legitimization, but there was no explicit reference to the Palestinian Arabs and their political or national rights.
But by 1930, British support for the Zionist movement began to weaken. Arab resistance was getting stronger, and the British were backing away from the idea of a Jewish homeland. British criticism of the Histadrut and their conclusion that Jewish policies damaged Arab economic development were evidenced by the publication of the Passfield White Paper, which limited Jewish migration into Palestine. Tragedy struck in 1936 when displaced Palestinian Arab farmers and workers went on a general strike to protest both pro-Zionist British policy and the dominance of Jewish labor. This would later transform into unorganized armed insurrections and outbreaks of violence against Jewish communities. The general strike was called for by the Grand Mufti, Amin al-Husseini, who delivered speeches that encouraged violence to oppose Jewish immigration. Alarmed by the chaos, the British began to impose harsh measures to quell the revolt, eventually turning to brutal suppression, even arming Jewish military units and instituting statutory martial law. Over the course of the next 3 years, the fatalities were immense. Several thousand Arabs and hundreds of Jews were killed. Ultimately, the revolt proved to be a tragic failure for both sides. For the Arabs, it was an economic and military loss, and for the Zionists, a severe political blow.
Following the revolt, the British issued the White Paper of 1939, which marked an end to pro-Zionist policies from Britain. This new diplomatic policy officially limited Jewish immigration for the next 5 years and forbade further Jewish purchase of land. More importantly, it explicitly stated that it is not part of His Majesty's government's policy that Palestine should become a Jewish state.
Likewise showed that the British were moving towards supporting Arab interests because they felt that Jewish immigration to Palestine was creating a situation that was becoming out of control.
The Zionists and Jews in Palestine were immediately enraged over what they saw as a betrayal by the British during a time when the Zionism movement was characterized by a renewed sense of urgency in the face of growing violence elsewhere in Europe. The Jewish Agency for Palestine even issued a statement shortly after, which accused the British of abandoning the Jews in what they called the darkest hour of Jewish history. The Arab nationalists in Palestine wanted a guarantee on permanent immigration restrictions and continued to clash with Zionists going forward.
The 1936 Arab Revolt represented a tragic break in relations between the Zionists and Palestinian Arab nationalists that continues to resonate throughout modern-day conflicts in the Middle East. What had transpired in the first half of the 20th century proved to have disastrous effects going forward by marginalizing the Palestinians and for much of the Jewish population in Europe, destroying a potential escape from the horrors leading up to and during World War II.
The Zionist movement would not be able to regain the same level of official recognition and ideological triumphs as it did in the early 1900s, and the Arab nationalists too would suffer from increasing violence in the coming years. As the British Shaw Commission noted, representatives of all parties told us that before the war, the Jews and Arabs lived side by side, if not in amity, at least with tolerance, a quality which today is almost unknown in Palestine. Tragically, a window of opportunity for peaceful coexistence during the Palestine Mandate period would be closed by British policy, Zionist attempts at asserting economic control, and Arab violence in response.
And so you get this picture where the Jewish actions are not violent in the way we typically think of violence, like someone taking a weapon and hurting somebody, but we're more of like a systematic pressure on Arabs that in many ways contributed to the conflict. And the actions of the Arabs were much more what we think of as like a traditional type of violence.
The fractured relationship between the Arab nationalists and Zionists during that time period are now critical to understanding the deep-rooted struggle for peace and stability in Palestine today.